Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a couple minutes.
Thanks for joining. It is.
Oh, I used to office here. Yeah. That was...
I probably don't wear my best, but...
Okay, I guess... All right. Hi, good evening, and thanks for taking time at the end of this long day. Really glad you were able to make it. My name is Srikanth Vasan. I'm founder and managing partner of Avesta Fund, and I'm here with a stellar cast of climate tech investors. So we're here to talk all about climate tech financing. Thought we'll do a quick round of intros, and then I had a handful of questions, and then turn it over to the audience. So again, my name is Srikanth Vasan. Our fund is Avesta Fund. It's a pre-seed and seed stage fund where climate tech is a big part of what we do. We also have a social impact aspect to it and tend to prefer diverse founding teams based out of here in Colorado. And I'm here with my fearless colleague, Zoe Wells. And have some background in the classic sort of venture-backed tech industry, but also in philanthropy, and more recently as a partner on Techstars investment team, looking at impact investments across the Techstars system. So.
Yeah. Hey everybody, my name is Kirsten Suddeth. I'm a general partner at Next Frontier Capital. NFC actually started in Bozeman, Montana, of all places. We're currently a very Rockies-focused firm, so all of our companies are based up and down the Rockies. We do, we're a generalist fund, B2B business model, generally late seed, Series A stage. Personally, I do kind of lead our climate tech practice. So it's a piece of what we do, so I'm happy to speak to what it's like to, as a climate tech founder, to talk to a generalist fund. A little bit of my background: started on the operator side. First company was used cooking oil recycling for biodiesel, super hippie company out of Boulder, Colorado. And then I spent a number of years on that side of the table, and then worked at Techstars as an entrepreneur in residence, and then with Mark at Blackhorn, and now Next Frontier.
Thank you, Kirsten. Hello, everybody. Really glad to be here with you. Look forward to hearing all the great questions you're going to have. My name's Mark Locke. I'm an operating partner at Blackhorn Ventures. Blackhorn is very proud of our headquarters here in Denver, just down the street from here, but we also have offices in Silicon Valley and New York. Blackhorn is focused on 4 hard-to-move industrial sectors: the transportation, built environment, energy, and logistics space. We come in through the angle of resource efficiency or resource productivity, feeling like you really got to find a way to pay the bills before you can get all the way to the climate impact pieces, but we try to look right through to get to that point. We are a Series Seed and Series A fund working with founders that have a bias for capital efficient information and computer technology driven business models, and we are just in the process of raising our 4th fund, Series Seed and Series A.
Hard acts to follow. Hi, my name is Jacqueline Rosamable. I'm the managing director at Venture for Climate Tech. Funny enough, I invest on behalf of New York State, but I do live here. We look for pre-seed, angel stage climate tech companies that we think can have outsized impacts on New York State. You do not need to be based in New York. You just have to have technology that applies. Our capital is actually non-dilutive. We provide up to $100K of catalytic capital for the founders that get into our programs, depending on the milestones they hit. Something a bit unique to our program, because we work at such early stage. Not all the founders that start per se make it all the way through, because we are tracking those milestones really tightly to make sure that they're on track. And we try to invest in companies that, again, relate to New York State. So buildings, transportation, carbon tech is a big focus for New York. And they're also spinning out InsurTech and FinTech programs. Our funder is called NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Authority. And they're an absolute leader in this space and in funding founders in unique ways. The way I try to think about it is we try to be the friends and family check for those who don't have it. And we look for companies, again, that can have that outsized impact. And we think that without our help, would maybe not make it to that next commercialization milestone. Before this, I was the regional director of the Americas for Techstars, managing from Canada through Argentina, helping different stakeholders answer that forever sticky question of how do you actually help founders, what actually moves the needle for them. And before that, I was the founder and CEO of a company that I built here called Revelar. It was a wearable safety device, and in a not enough time here to figure it out journey, that's how I got really close to the folks at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and sparked my career in this space. So I do believe that security and climate go hand in hand, and excited to chat with you all today.
Excellent, thank you all. And as I hope you can see, there's a variety of investors represented here, everything from pre-seed and seed to a climate-focused partner in a generalist firm to a seed and later financing with a focus on resource efficiency and non-dilutive funding. So hopefully the variety of viewpoints can be represented. I figure, Kirsten, if I might start with you, just because the Denver Startup Week historically has had it sort of goes heavy on classic tech. So maybe we can start with just sort of setting up the similarities and differences between the classic tech VC world and the climate tech VC world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot more similarities, at least kind of in the work that I do than not. I think as a founder, one of the things that I learned to ask was when I was speaking with a potential investor was like, is this equity capital or non-dilutive? And is your fund, how does your fund think about climate tech or impact? Because every fund is slightly different. Some funds are non-concessionary. That means they're looking for venture capital returns. And other funds are willing to take a slightly less return if you can provide a really big impact. So by knowing that up front, that allows you to really reach your investor from their perspective. But otherwise, most of the companies that we see in climate tech in Colorado that can be funded by venture capital are highly similar, face similar problems. How do we hire the best teammates? How do we find product market fit? How do we scale this business? And then they have the added bonus, in my view, of saying, look at the impact we can have on the world, and if this becomes a business that reaches 100 million, in revenue, like think about how the world is going to look differently, and that's a really fun picture as an investor to get to see with the founder.
Cool. Anything you'd like to add?
To build upon what she was saying, it is a lot of the same metrics, right? Revenue solves a lot of issues in conversations with investors. If you can show that, hey, we have sales or a pilot that is going well, right? You're looking at the same metrics. For climate-specific investors, some of them do have, like, if you think of like Prime or other sources of funding, they'll look for a certain cap of GHG emissions, either half a gigaton or a full gigaton of impact. So I'd say maybe some of the nuances I see is companies in climate can raise a lot of non-dilutive capital. Some of these programs offer millions in non-dilutive capital for founders in this space. But you have to be able to prove that gigaton threshold and usually have external validation for that. I think a lot of the funds have told me that once they set the number of a gigaton, somehow every company that talked to them was able to make the case for a gigaton. And so then they have to like backwards work on like, okay, for this to be true, what do I have to believe to be possible? And I think while a lot of those metrics are the same, if you can speak in terms of like hard metrics to that, that does open more doors in funding. So
maybe just to pick up on that, since you also have the mic, given that you worked with so many climate founders over the years, how would you describe some of the archetypes of founders, and maybe even talk about software-heavy versus hardware-heavy climate tech startups, and what the milestones look like and how they're different for different kinds of founders?
Yeah, I look at the archetypes because I work with sort of what I call top-of-funnel pipeline. I get to see a lot of what's coming in like 10 years. They fall into sort of three buckets that I've seen. There is the PhD or academic founder turned entrepreneur. Usually they know their innovation inside and out. They were probably the creator of that innovation. But they very quickly need to find a business partner to balance out their skill sets. Right? No one person, I always tell people that there's no way I can know every inch of climate tech, right? And same goes for a business, right? If your genius is in, you've created a new material that captures CO2 and can replace, you know, some horrible product that's currently on the market and it has a unit economics, great, but you're gonna need that business side to balance you out as that type of founder. The other one we've seen is the serial entrepreneur turned climate tech founder. So an example of that that's pretty well known is like Noya. And so these are founders that have had success in other industries. Or one of my companies, Voltpost, he was the director of innovation at Samsung, had been an entrepreneur before that, and now he's converting lampposts into electric vehicle charging stations. He has a hardware background, but it's his first time building in climate, so he doesn't per se need my help in how to find investors and pitch to them. He needs my help breaking into government or pilots or getting the network needed to, because it's a different network. And then the other one that I call them the industry expert turned entrepreneur. So these are people like one of my founders was a top level executive at Swiss Re, a reinsurance company, super specific skill set if you know reinsurance. And she's building a platform because she's like, the data that insurance companies is using is dead. It's no longer has predictive value. We have to adjust how insurance companies think about risks and they have to be part of that solution. I don't know anybody that could do that other than her, right? Because she just knows she understands it. It's such a risk adverse. I mean, they're literally insurance companies. And so that founder usually knows their industry in and out, so you don't need to network them or introduce them to, you know, corporate partners. But it's their first time hiring a team with no money or building a deck for investors, and it's a very different game. And so that's what I've seen. And then so we're along software, hardware, even deep tech, I've seen that range. So I would love to hear what you all see, but that's what I've seen.
You know, I'd add one more to this, which is first-time entrepreneur. You know, and you see this a lot in the climate tech space because there's such an inspiration. I got to do something about this for myself, if not my children. And so, you know, it just carries through. And there's so much coming out of the undergraduate and the graduate programs now where people are getting a chance to really develop their ideas there. So you see a lot of that coming out. And how it gets manifested is that there's a degree of enthusiasm, energy, and excitement coupled with absolute fear. That they tamp down every single day and try to make sure you don't think they're scared. And there's also a question of trust because they, you know, think everybody's trying to steal their idea, trying to take their equity, trying to not really be helpful to them in the process, and trying to find people that you can trust, that you can ask how these things happen. Even being in forums like this is a great way to be doing that. But I think this is something that really, what you guys are doing is fantastic, is helping people find their way through that.
So just continuing that theme, Mark, and I guess it's also helpful to think of climate timelines versus venture fund timelines, which, I mean, still, but there are some exceptions, and we could talk about that. I know you have some experience. We'll touch upon that a little bit too. But assuming the 10-year life cycle and the much longer lead times for some of these tech innovations to come to fruition, what sort of non-dilutive funding options might a startup think about early in their lives so that you can sort of get some of that going, achieve your very early milestones till you're more sort of venture fundable, if you will? Yeah. And what kind of pluses or minuses or restrictions might those have? Yeah,
look, this is a question which I was a little fearful for answering because if I came up with all the non-dilutive funding, I'm sure there'd be a pretty long line of people wanting to talk, because everybody loves non-dilutive funding, and it does come with a burden along with it. And I will say something about this kind of arc of time. And keep in mind, my starting point on this was during the Jimmy Carter era, doing early stage solar thermal facilities. And so I've watched this arc over 35 years. and keep seeing it by bumps along the way. So there's not any amount of non-dilutive funding that will carry you through some of those kind of bumps within the way. But just with that as a caveat, I mean, everybody kind of knows of some of these. There's the DOE, ARPA-E funds, which are sizable in their nature. There's also quite a lot of foundation grant funding from in the Hewletts and the Packards of the world that really care about the space and are putting grant monies in front of people. There's prize competitions as well. So those would be ones that are kind of classical, non-dilutive. And I think the thing with those is each one of them has a cost with it. You know, the DOE and ARPA-E ones, if you are not a superb grant writer and knowing how to go about doing that, it can be a really waste of time. I have seen some teams that have been unbelievably good at that. But if you're not good at that, either find somebody who's good at it to help you in doing those kind of things. And the point I'd make on the other ones is that you got to think about the trade-off between time to go after these things, which in a startup, your most valuable resource is your time. Yeah, thanks. And the payout that you're going to get on these things. And so if you go away from just pure non-dilutive into spaces like accelerators and incubators and places like that, it's to get really clear about what it is that you need and what is it that they deliver, and make sure there's a match. And don't just sign up for every one of these that might be possible. Really think about if there's something that's going to make a difference for you.
Can you guys still hear us? Okay, cool. All right, I'll just be really, really loud, so let me know. I'm Latin, I can just shout. I think your point on non-dilutive funding, it takes a long time. My founders will wait a whole year to hear back if they were rejected. If they're rejected, they have to wait a whole year all over again. So non-dilutive funding is intensive. Somebody has to then manage these grants, right? These grants are usually can only be used for specific areas of your business. So if you think about, like, a lot of these grants are like only let you hire technical people. Well, there's a lot more hires to a company than just technical people, and you still need those. So ideally it is a mix, and some founders go straight for angel funding or VC funding, and then when they built out enough team, they start to go after those grants because then they have the bandwidth. And others are, like, to your point, amazing at writing grants. And, you know, I've had some founders close over $4 million in non-dilutive funding, and they don't even have an office yet. Right? Their product is hypothetical, but they were able to, oh, thank goodness, get past that, yay. So yes, non-dilutive capital is amazing, but it's also restrictive, and it's actually why our program splits and has milestone based. That way we don't have to dictate how people spend the non-dilutive capital, because most grants do dictate how you can spend your dollars.
And maybe one quick add-on to that, Jackie. Around not so much non-dilutive, but patient funding options, where there may be some examples of those that I know you've worked with in the past.
Absolutely. So I've taken some of my founders through diligence through organizations like Prime Coalition. They're out of Boston. Amazing, right? Catalytic Capital. They literally say we want to invest in the companies that everybody else is too afraid to invest in. But Catalytic Capital, patient capital, right? Because there's so few of these sources, it's usually a very intensive due diligence process. Not only do they only sort of let you pitch once a quarter, but you're pitching in front of, like, their council of 25, right? There's a lot of different steps. And so kind of like non-dilutive capital, there's a few stage gates to get into that kind of funding. But if you have a technology that is really hard to fund because it's, you know, going to be capital intensive, but has that gigaton, right? So these more patient capital, they're not expecting a return in 5, 7, 10 years. They're willing to look out the 30 years that Mark is talking about necessary for those returns. Their capital and their LPs understand that. But because of that, you have to check a lot of extra boxes. You have to come ready with your emissions data. So a lot of that has to be already packaged before you can go to those funders.
Yeah, and I'll add one other idea in here, and this is not so much for a startup, but it's something to keep in mind. Sometimes the best time to look for non-dilutive funding is when you're 2 steps into the business, and you're able to identify a specific thing that would be just catalytic for the business, and it's got a really high risk, but you're proving yourself enough that people trust you, and you're able to get that kind of money. One company I'm working with just got $20 million for a skunk works on a piece of technology that it ended up being transformative. But it was because they had done things up to that point. So sometimes when people get down that path, they stop thinking about non-dilutive funding because they only think about it as a startup. Sometimes the best places to get it is 1 step or 2 steps further in.
So Kirsten, maybe you could talk about the role of the national labs and the university labs, because there's so much innovation that's happening in those areas and how they can be helpful to startups.
Yeah, and I think...
And maybe also touch upon the Colorado footprint within
I was just going to say, I think we're particularly blessed with an incredible just breadth and depth of labs that we have in Colorado specifically. I think last I checked, we were up to like 33 national labs. And, I tried to find the nationwide number for this. I think it's around 300. So when you think about that, we're really punching above our weight class here in Colorado, and it's something that as startups can be a little bit daunting, and I think you're probably a good resource a little bit, at least for the state of New York, but in terms of how you break into a lab, that can be daunting. In my experience looking at companies in our portfolio that have been successful, I've seen 2 paths. I'm sure there are more. The first is oftentimes labs will have some kind of event, a pitch event or a showcase, and those are great ways to figure out the who at that particular facility that you should be getting in touch with. And then secondly, of course, there's the funding aspect as well, right? So looking at, are they offering some non-dilutive grants, and then working that angle as well. But there are people at a lot of these facilities that are dedicated to commercialization, and they're usually much easier to find on LinkedIn and stuff than some of the other scientists, and they can be a great resource just in how to navigate these kind of opaque organizations.
Anything you'd add?
Depending on which one you want to work with, there's fellowships that will pay your salary and the salary of, let's say, your CTO. So Activate, Cyclotron Road, these are 2-year fellowships that partner with some of the bigger national labs. And so if you know that you are hoping to partner with one or work with one, there's definitely some great programs. I think Westgate from NREL also just, I think, had their first group. And so they do have amazing programs, and some of them do come with funding.
So continuing that theme around the role that government can play more broadly in climate tech financing, and perhaps with that context, you can also touch upon the Inflation Reduction Act and what that's meant. Can you just describe that in 60 seconds?
Sure. Yeah, that's 60 seconds. So, we were doing some prep, and we had different topics that we thought we would need to cover, and we said, let's all check off which ones we might be willing to do. And I checked this one off. Nobody else checked this one off. I felt obligated because for Blackhorn, we have an operating partner, former Governor Bill Ritter, who really is a policy expert on this, and he's been really fantastic in helping us think about these things, and it's really important. But let me just check. How many people have read the 2,900-page bill so they know what's in it here? Just okay, nerd. So, it's, there's a, I don't know if this is a pretty young crowd, so I don't know. Ronald Reagan said the 9 most evil words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And so that doesn't quite sound like the IRA is the thing that you're going to be going to. But where the government is really good at is helping you think about how to make really transformational changes. So they were huge investors in the internet and kind of helping that come to bear. And this is kind of on the scale of that kind of an opportunity. And if I look at this at the highest level, the IRA it's like if they opened up a new candy shop on 16th Street Mall. And if you understand your sweet tooth, you probably could find your preferred sweet within there. Unfortunately, it's hooked to one of those little grappling hooks that they have at the bowling alleys where you got to go grab the rabbit and go put it into a bin to be able to get out and win the prize. So there is an art that's going to be part of being able to get at these things. But when you look at the magnitude of it, the $369 billion IRA is 4 times more than what was in climate response activities in the 2008 recovery plan, and it's 6 times more than what has been spent in the 10 years before that through government entities. So the scale of it is enormous, and the scope of it is very, very broad. So you can find kind of your interest just about any place, as I was speaking about the candy stores. It includes the investment tax credits for being able to put solar and other renewables up. It gets to bringing manufacturing back into the country to be able to supply that so we don't have dependencies on other places. It has sequestration for carbon that has not been part of the plan beforehand. It has hydrogen. It has built environment for energy efficiency. So go through the list. It just kind of gives a really great coverage of the different topic areas. And some of the things that are really interesting within it is it also provides multipliers. So if you're doing things that are really serving underserved communities, there's a 5x multiplier on the kind of opportunities you can tap into. So there's a huge amount of opportunity within there, but it really takes the time of thinking about not what money am I chasing, but what business do I have, and then what money is available to support that business. And so much can encourage people not to go decide they're going to try to go service a lower middle income community if that's really not in their business model. But if it is, there's a lot of benefit for being able to tap into those things. So I'll leave that with that. When we get to the question answer, I'm happy to try to take on a few more things, but I'm not going to try to dive into any more details than that.
That's a great summary. Yeah. So Jackie, picking up on something you said earlier about GHG emissions and so on. So more broadly around the kinds of reporting that investors might look for from climate startups, and where a startup founder might get some help with that.
I don't have great news here. Nobody can agree. There's about 10 different tools, and everybody has their own methodology. So probably, one of the first people to take a crack at it, is my understanding, is Prime Coalition. They have a tool called the Crane tool. They partner with a group called Row Impact that can help you either validate your data or try to work within their tool. It can be tougher if you're earlier stage, because a lot of that content that you'd have to fill out. We partner in New York with something called P2I, the Pollution Prevention Institute, and actually our funder covers their working with our founders to make the case for their emissions impact, and that way we can say, hey, this group has externally validated. They might need to re-engage with somebody else in the future once they have more data, but this is our first hypothesis on the emissions data that we can have. And I've also recently learned that a lot of these orgs, because a lot of my, some of my more academic founders tend to be very literal, and they'll be like, well, our direct emissions is this. And I was like, cool, but what do you enable? What are some of your indirect emissions reductions? And there are ways of navigating that and being able to tell that narrative. And there's different organizations, like NREL has a program called NCAP, where you can get 40 hours as an entrepreneur of their help towards something like this. So there's definitely organizations that can help you gather that data, but I find it best to work with somebody external, which I know can be tough in the early days when things are tight. They try to make it as affordable as possible to work with these different organizations, but they are going to do the diligence on that data. They are going to rip it apart, and they're going to have to find that the logic is there, right? If you're saying, hey, we hit a gigaton, but we're going to own 100% of this market, okay, I don't think anyone's going to buy that. So your strategy has to match what you are saying your emissions will match, and so it takes time. I've worked with some founders over a year to get to their real core data. So just be patient with that, but do know that some of those bigger non-dilutive funding do have that as a key metric. But I mean, you guys have also done a ton of work on trying to measure impact. And it's hard, right? Nobody really has come to a conclusion on this is the way.
Yeah, look, I'll add to this just through the lens of Blackhorn Ventures, where I led before, where we said that we're really focused on resource productivity as a way into the investments that we make, but with a clear knowledge that those things are very often connected to impact outcomes. But what we've found with that kind of domain depth that we bring to this, that climate funds then come to us, and they're saying, we want to make sure we understand the business model and the solution that is being applied here, and then we'll work with you to help the companies get more clear about the impact of outcomes they're likely to get at. And so there's more and more help coming on this front. I have no doubt whatsoever about that. I was just at the Credit Suisse Carbon Conference in San Diego this past week, and was just stunned by the advances that have happened for both startups as well as ecosystem players of the likes of Stripe, Frontier, Patch, that are there really supporting more organizations to be able to bring this kind of support to it. And if I could just give one really big caution, is that the number of companies that are coming at us right now with, we're going to save a billion gigatons, but without a business model behind it, but trust us, we're going to get it, is, there's going to be some real attraction for going after that, and just really encourage people to keep looking for how does this thing make money as you're on your way to impact, because that's going to give you a lot more comfort when you're trying to go to sleep at night.
So one other thing. Oh,
sorry. An example of that, because one of the things that Kirsten talked about was that the metrics aren't that different. There's a great example in like Lilac Solutions. They've gotten a lot of funding. It's a eco-friendlier way of doing lithium mining, and not only is it significantly better for the planet, but it's like 80% cheaper. Even if it wasn't, it's 80% cheaper, right? So it's a great business model, and so those two things absolutely have to go hand in hand.
So looking further down the life of a startup, right? So we've been talking about the early stage world, but if unlike the tech world, where it's a pretty standard pre-seed, seed, Series A, B, C, and if you're lucky, you go IPO or you get bought at boatloads of money. Here, there's a lot of non-VC kind of funding too that comes to play as you get bigger. So maybe, Mark, you can touch upon some of those kinds of funding that are out there, but also what a startup can do early in their lives to make sure that they're ready for it when they grow up to be at that stage.
Yeah, there's kind of two answers I would give to it. Some of it is just the basics of what you should do to go build a startup. And I would, make sure you anchor on that as a starting point, which are just basic things about product market fit, and making sure you get proof of concept and you find ways to get the initial expansions and show that you can get traction. So those are kind of table stakes, I know. But within this space, there's a lot of project financing that becomes the important part of being able to grow the business. You can think of the equity capital as being kind of the fire that lights the flame, but ultimately the project finance capital is the juice that kind of keeps the machine running and determines how far it's going to go. And so often when we're talking to people very early on, they're saying, well, we're going to use project finance to be able to go grow this. And you say, well, where's it going to come from? And they're going to go, well, it's a bit of it, build it and they will come. And trying to have that conversation from very early on in terms of who are some of the parties that might be able to go do that, looking for funders who do that. Sometimes it's pretty expensive to be able to find those early funders who are willing to go do that. Sometimes they structure it in odd sort of ways where they'll take a bit of an equity position with you, they'll look for warrant coverage, they'll ask you for high interest rates as they're going about doing it. But really thinking about how you're going to start shaping that from very early on, and don't say it will come. I have at least 3 different companies that I've worked with over time that have been absolutely fantastic companies, really built out the early stage of it, and then just hit an absolute freight train on the project finance side. And it's because they just didn't have enough experience within the model yet to be able to go tap into lower cost, project finance capital.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I would add to, when I look at the companies we funded in this space, there's kind of 2 trajectories. The more software heavy businesses, the funding path looks very similar, to a non-climate tech or non-impact focused business. The difference, the one difference that we haven't really talked about yet is the ability to think about venture debt as a tool, which can usually come into play at Series A and later. You can raise typically maybe a third of the round size that you're raising at the time you're raising the round. It's a great time to do it. The capital is cheaper if you do it when you're raising your equity round. And you can use that to extend runway and to fund your operations. So it's a really nice tool. And I've seen for some of my companies that have the data that you guys are talking about and have this positive impact, there's some banks that will do slightly lower cost of capital on those venture debt deals rather than the kind of typical Silicon Valley bank. I think that's nascent, but I do think we'll see more of that. And then the second thing is, for companies that are on maybe a different path, I'll touch a little bit on some of the things I've seen on the exit side, because I think that can look a little bit different as well, especially when you have an invention that can be commercialized in different ways. We've seen this in kind of the lidar and photonic space, applying to different industries. We've also seen it in biomineralizations, where you have an invention, right? So this is one of those archetypes, and you figure out the first way to commercialize it. And there's a way to have a partial exit kind of early in the life cycle of the business, if you're able to get to some sort of scale in that space, right? So maybe you commercialize in the energy space and you get to maybe 10 million in revenue, and you've built a nice operational business that relies on the invention, but it's not the only thing the invention can do. I've seen companies sell that part of the business and then go back to the invention and say, where else can we commercialize that, right? So it's later in the stage of the business. They have funding from this acquisition to go and test an R&D in other areas, and they can also be pretty successful doing some SBIRs or some DOE money in order to, do it again, right? And so these are really interesting companies that can have sort of these multiple points of liquidity especially where it might be hard to see like a huge market, which is something that the venture looks for.
You triggered one other thought, and this is probably really well known in the group, so apologize if I'm just saying something is really well known, but it's the good, the bad, and the ugly of strategic partners. Strategics are fantastic for being able to be an early on partner for proof of concept, and really working with you to be able to have something that really is relevant. And they can be really helpful if they also can be a scaling partner with you as well. And the venture investors really like them if they're really a constructive player. The bad and then the ugly is if they, for whatever reason, decide to suggest leading around, that is 50% or 100% over what would be a financial investor's estimation of it. And I find this happens more often with first-time entrepreneurs, because it seems like always a bigger number is better. And it is until you can't cover that nut the next time you're trying to go do a raise and you're either in a down round, or even worse, it's kind of a setup by the strategic to, hey, I'll just acquire you at a very discounted rate. And so trying to find the right place for those kind of partners as a part of that kind of growth scenario, and this happens really a lot in the more hardware-oriented parts of the business.
So let me do one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So keep your questions ready. So Kirsten, recognizing that Denver Startup Week is not just founders and investors, but also a lot of folks who are looking to join startups, and any advice you would have for job seekers in this space, and how they would go about figuring out which company to join, and how that might be different than a traditional tech startup?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it resonates for me personally, because I was never the CEO. I have to go pursue this idea. I was always, let me go find an idea that I can really get behind, and a team that I want to join, and I can figure out the how, how we fund, how we, operate, and the like. And so, one of the things we talked about in preparing for this is that there might be some of those folks in the audience here as well. And I think, step one is great that you're here. Hopefully you'll also join us for the happy hour after the panel just here in this building and get to meet, the first step is just meeting and seeing who's out there. And I think the second step is doing kind of some introspection and thinking about what is the impact that you want to have in the world, and making sure you're aligning your personal values and the impact that you want to see with the kind of companies that you're speaking with. And then I think the third is figuring out how your skill set can be leveraged by those companies. And so if you're, especially if you're kind of a switcher into the climate tech space, I think it's pretty easy to switch industry or functional area, but not both, right? You got to be able to kind of sell yourself and the skill set that you bring. And I think if you're a finance expert, it's easy to go from industry to industry, or vice versa. If you're a climate tech expert and maybe your first role was in product and you decided to go get an MBA, you can switch into a different kind of functional area. But thinking about, how to tell your story in a way that's going to resonate with those businesses. And I think, I've seen those two things work really well and paired.
Yeah, no, I like to say you don't want to have two hills to climb up at once. So pick the hill you want to climb on. So let me turn it over to the audience. Any questions? Go ahead.
You had mentioned the national labs. What happens if your product is, in some sense, competing against their
You want to repeat the question?
Yeah, if you can repeat the question.
The question was, what if your technology is competing potentially with something the national labs are doing? The national labs are, in many ways, mandated, right, to work with entrepreneurs, right? Their best outcome is technology going to market. So I had one of my founders, I'll give this exact example, Olokun Minerals. They're taking brine waste from desalination plants, separating it out, and then reclaiming more water, and then separating out those further minerals to then repackage and resell, right? I went to go speak to my friends at NREL. I was letting him know about my portfolio, and he's like, does she have some tech to separate those minerals? I was like, oh, they're working on it. He goes, oh, we have something. Why not work with us, and we can just license it to her? Nobody else is looking to license this right now. So they can be a boon, right? You can end up making, if you have a technology, and it could be like you're like, this one part's killing me, right? They can actually really be helpful. And so I have found those folks to be very mission-oriented, very high integrity, and they have programs, albeit imperfect, to support entrepreneurs. Because there are, sometimes there's clauses like you can only manufacture in the US. That's a complicated layer for some companies. But I find that, kind of what he said, right? A lot of founders are, and I get that. When I was a first-time founder, I joke, I made my mom sign an NDA, so I completely understand the fear of being a first-time founder. I really do. It's like a hard paranoia to break. But most people are trying to be helpful, and it really all comes down to execution, right? So reach out to those folks. You never know. Maybe they're looking for somebody to take their tech and take it to market, and you could end up getting that exclusive license like my founder did.
And there's another aspect too. So let's say there is some expertise in one of these national labs, very similar to what you're building. That can be a very big opportunity as well, because investors are often looking for third-party validation. And the kind of imprimatur you get from the national lab saying, yeah, we worked with these guys on this technology, can be a very useful signal as well. So it can be an opportunity more so than a threat.
I just add one thing to this, just having worked with the national labs on a couple of different things, is that you got to remember that national lab scientists are people too. And that, trying to figure out what it is that's for them in this, and it's not about you, but what is it that makes it work for them, and also trying to test out, is this somebody that you can actually work with? These things I find almost more important than whether there's a conflict, because if you've got those things working, you know how they get a win, you know how to work with them, all those other things are generally very solvable. And
they've often been good sources of talent. If you need the expertise in a particular area, there can be someone you can add to the team. Mm-hmm.
You said at the beginning that you all have different approaches to investing, but the common theme that I heard was Series C, Series A, pre-Series C. Is there later stage funding available for climate tech?
There is, and ever bigger pockets. Oh yeah, the question is there later stage funding available in the climate tech space? I'm sure others will have a lot to add as well. But yes, more and more large pools of capital are collecting, and if anything, I think there's a fair amount of growth capital out there and some tens of billions collecting out there. I think often, at least in our little world, I'd say we find the inflection point from when it's a science project to when it's something commercializable is the part that is hard to figure out when that inflection point is. But once you've made that thing, there's a lot of money out there. Getting past that valley of death is the challenge early on.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to this is that this being Denver Startup Week, we did orient that direction, but there is so much capital needed for so many of these kinds of projects that, yes, there's huge amounts. And whether you talk about some of the very higher end venture capital firms like a Capricorn that are putting, literally billions into companies, even here in Boulder, Vision Ridge, just made a big $1 billion investment in a truck vehicle charging infrastructure play. So there is plenty there, and it's really just a question of, can you show the commercial case? Can you show the kind of traction to be able to do it? And let's be very clear. Every one of us on this panel here wants that to be the place that you're going to be able to go get money.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add one resource to check out. There's a great newsletter that comes out every week, Climate Tech VC, and they aggregate every single climate deal each week, and they usually feature a really interesting invention or an acquisition, and they have all that on their website as well. And so that helps you keep tabs of what, who's writing checks, how big are those rounds, and what ideas are getting funded at each stage. So it's just a great resource if you're in this space to read each week.
The nuance there, right? Early stage, we think we know how we're going to make money. We think we know how we're going to impact emissions. By the time you're getting to that growth stage, if you don't have that data, and to the point that Mark made, sometimes my funders would be offered a deal that I'm like, okay, but are you going to be able to hit the milestones necessary for that valuation to make sense in 2 years? Because if not, then you're going to end up in a horrible situation. But at the stage that we invest, right, it's in as much as the human we're investing in and our belief that they can execute, and the market opportunity for that technology versus a later stage financing where, in theory, there's data and metrics and sales. And so it's just a very different way of looking at companies, I think.
We're kind of the card counters in Vegas, and these guys are the casino owners.
Yeah. It's tough. My understanding is like 80% of infrastructure projects die, right? They don't even get the chance. They'll get that initial funding. Some of it dies in the legal process. I do have a company trying to solve for that, but yes, infrastructure projects are tough.
I would say though that I think the ground is shifting from under us right now in a positive way, because I mean, whether you take the last year's infrastructure bill or this year's IRA, there's a lot of funding and loan guarantee programs which are inherently there's sort of a multiplier effect built into that. There's a ton of money coming into, notwithstanding what you said, I think things are changing and some of those holes are starting to get filled, I would submit. Go ahead.
What do you guys think about AngelList role vehicle? I don't know if you've seen other companies that are doing similar things where they have like 100.
Could you speak up?
Yeah. What do you guys think about AngelList roll-up vehicle function? There's several other companies that are doing similar strategies where they'll have like 100+ accredited investors put money into a fund after they've distributed like their details, like are they safe now, are they a corporation right now, and they have to check off all those things. What do you guys think about that as funding?
Happy to go on that, or do you have
A couple of comments on it. Yeah, the question was, how do we think about aggregators of angel lists that are people that are qualified investors, right? So these are not only people that want to just throw a check into the space, but have some real experience and judgment, and they're just trying to pool it as opposed to putting it into a fund. Am I saying that correctly? Yeah. So, you know, I guess I would say I'm really, I see a couple of things. One is that's not a bad way to kind of get started. If you're really trying to get your idea together, it's probably better than a Kickstarter campaign. And I have seen people go about doing that. In particular, if what that's doing is giving them exposure to somebody who might really be a mentor as opposed to it's just a way to go get a check. And would be looking for those kind of connections of what you're trying to get into. I think the other side of it is how does that impact the next round of funding that you're trying to get, in particular if you're trying to go to an institutional investor. Because if your cap table looks like a mess, which doesn't necessarily have to happen in this case if it's a single check coming in across a bunch of different people, but if it looks like it's a very complicated set of people that are going to input to that CEO's decision making down the road, that becomes a real block.
I would say on a positive note there, because AngelList has thought through some of these challenges too, and they have some well-defined structures around the syndicate and these evergreen funds, et cetera, where they deal with the cap table issue. This is one check, one per entity that's investing, and there's a positive, I would say like anything, it depends on whose money you're getting. There are hundreds of syndicates on AngelList, but the top 30 are actually worth a lot because the people behind them and the people around the syndicate owner are very sort of experienced folks. So it depends on whose money you're getting. And so I wouldn't necessarily, I would certainly say look behind who's there, and it's a welcome place because AngelList is thinking fairly creatively about figuring out how to create more pools of capital that are aligned with the founders, et cetera. I'll kick it off. I'm sure everyone has opinions on this. Yeah. But, the question is sort of, I've been in clean tech for 15 years, and things went up and then came back down. How is it different this time? And it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. But, so clean tech 1.0 versus climate tech, as we call it now, or clean tech 2.0. I'd say a few things, and I'm sure others will add more. First of all, the urgency is far greater now, with 15 years later, and more carbon is in the atmosphere, and we have less time to do anything about it. And net zero, whether you look at the 2030 timeline or 2050, we're just that much closer to it. So it's a bigger problem staring us in the face. I'd also say we have some examples of success, right? PV cells costs have gone down by more than 90% since then. The wind energy costs have gone down by a third. Lithium-ion batteries costs have come down by a similar order of magnitude. So some of those are starting to show that this thing can happen. Some people, whether it was Germany sort of taking that extra initial risk around wind and solar, for instance, and helping you go down the cost curve. So, people can look around and say that's happened there. Maybe it's geothermal's time now, or it's hydrogen's time, etc. And so there's both the imminent danger, but also some points of success. And I think people have gotten smarter too, where the first time around, people took a very classic VC look into it, and that's partly why we wanted to get some of these questions teased out, saying it is similar to VC in certain parts of climate tech, but it's also different in other parts. And people are a bit more nuanced about how they think about it as investors as well. So, here.
Yeah, you know, I take I agree with everything you just said, but then a degree of caution. And number one, I would say we don't get to Clean Tech 2.0 if we didn't do Clean Tech 1.0, and actually that was a very big success in terms of us being where we're at today. So it's, you know, to make sure we, you know, hang on to that particular point. The second thing I would just raise a caution on is what's the next Solyndra mistake, which is like way overshooting where things are at, which gets to the cost structure that Shrikant was talking about. And the place that I would put that out right now is on carbon credits, and or just the tailwind feeling of the IRA. I was in a board meeting the other day and with a well-known venture capital company, and they were advising the company that even though they just got done doing a raise like 3 months before, that because the IRA, they ought to come out there and go do another $300 million raise at a 50% markup from where they were just 3 months ago on the back of the IRA. And I, under my breath, said, I smell Solyndra. And, you know, it did not go very well in terms of my comment. But my point is that there's going to be those kind of mistakes. And just, you know, encouraging people to be, you know, conscious that you still got to make the business grow as you go through these things.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything. The only thing I'd add is if you zoom out and think about just the world picture today, like the geopolitical and how that intersects with climate change, energy, you know, political powers in the world, it's really interesting to study. I think Europe has a lot more influence today when you look at what's moving companies' behavior in the US. A lot of it is actually now driven by things that are happening overseas. And you know, I was at the early part of my career in the Clean Tech 1.0 wave, but to me that feels very different.
Yes, I was curious about how often you see as clean tech investors anything about geothermal energy development. A lot of projects that are coming online for carbon dioxide reduction, like DAC and carbon sequestration and storage, these are being run on fossil energy. And so it seems like the pairing of those two, renewable energy and carbon drawdown structures, needs to happen. But geothermal is not even on most people's radar, and it's something that we'd like to investigate, seeing if we can access the resource at any faster speed than current technologies allow. But if it can't get funded, then there's no real business case, even though we have like lots of people who can benefit from drilling faster to access geothermal heat for power. So what is your take as clean tech investors on how well received that idea might be to yourselves and to other clean tech investors? Just the idea of being able to access geothermal energy much more readily and put it out there to the marketplace.
Yeah, Dahl, good to see you. And the question was really around, is geothermal's time? And it seems like a really sensible, you know, reliable alternative source for a lot of things that are need that sort of resource. And I think you may be right. It may be geothermal's time. And there is a lot of technologies that we're seeing coming through that are tapping into that. And so, you know, what I found in a lot of these hard tech ones is that getting the time exactly right is really hard. And trying to go persuade people of that before they're ready to hear it is difficult. But I think you're in a good space, and I think it'll get there. It's, you know, there's a big question if it's a next year, which is when you need it to as a startup, or if it's 3 years down the road, which is where it becomes more challenging.
When I was a first-time founder, don't know if that resonates, but I hired a CTO that when anybody would look at me and say, how are you going to manage your supply chain? I would just be like, are you kidding me? Like, he is. That's who's going to do it. And so if you're trying to do something that is incredibly tough to do, if you can pull off finding talent from one of the success versions of that, I find that makes your life a lot easier when pitching for funding, because I've seen some really cool geothermal companies come across my desk, and I've had a hard time getting our funders on board to pick one of those. And usually it's because one of the biggest objections is, but there's nobody on this team that has the experience scaling or executing this, and I think it's really normal. So I kind of coming down to startup foundational pieces, like build a team around yourself that if people ask, okay, if you don't have that skill set, who on your team does? I think that will always help those conversations.
On that point, if I might add, it may sound a bit controversial, but I think if you consider the oil and gas industry knows how to drill, and whether it's horizontal or vertical, and there's a lot of, and geothermal is ultimately about drilling holes down and figuring out how to use heat pumps and collect the heat and so on. There's a lot of expertise out there which needs to be repurposed too, so.
So I just want to ask you guys about funding timelines, right? What is the timeline from pitch to a check, and then how do startups infiltrate VC firms? Because as a startup myself, I have a lot of good connections into venture capital overseas, Silicon Valley, so on and so forth. But I've noticed a lot of startups having trouble just getting in the front door and being able to even have the opportunity to say something.
Yeah, I can jump in. The question is timeline from kind of first meeting to getting a term sheet, and then also a question on like how to, accessibility. How do you access funders? I kind of have in the more traditional, I'll talk traditional VC and then maybe pass over to you guys. Two kind of hacks for this. One, when you think about, okay, let's say you want to raise seed, sometimes if you don't have the built-in network, right, of those warm intros, I think what works tremendously well is to look at who's your potential funder for the next round or the next round after that. Because those funds have bigger AUM, they have bigger teams, and they have analyst associates that are completely dedicated to sourcing. So those people are much easier to reach, right? Especially if you fit within their thesis. They say, I might be too early, but I would love to pick your brain. Then ask them who, say the meeting goes well, and they're like, yeah, this is something we would do, but you're too early. Say, great, who do you usually follow? Like, which funds do you follow? Can you introduce me, right? And so that's kind of one way to back into it. And then around the second question, which is, how do you basically increase, or your chances of having a quicker process? One, if you can, make a market, right? Anytime you have more investors interested, it will move everybody else quicker. Two, try to open up informal lines of communication with your investor, right? Or the investor you're speaking with. So a lot of it is kept really formally, like through email, could we schedule 20 minutes of time? And if you start trying to open up more informal lines, like maybe you text them after a meeting and say, hey, I totally forgot to ask this one really easy thing, right, that they can do a quick response to. Say, great, I just want to also open up informal lines. You're going to learn really quickly whether that investor is really interested or not, right? Because your goal is to not waste your time and to get to a quick, like, okay, yeah, cool, or a quick, no, it's based on our meeting, I think it's not a fit. That's a win for you too as a founder because time is so valuable.
And I'll add, I think it takes a lot of discipline. I always tell my founders you should spend like 3 to 4 months prepping for your raise before you even go after it. Having a strong investor pipeline, understanding who you're talking to, their thesis. A lot of them write blogs, right? And often founders will knock on doors of VCs who, they'll take the meeting, but it doesn't fit their thesis. And convincing an investor, you're asking them to sort of do the impossible, right? They have investors, they have LPs, and so really honing in and understanding who you're talking to and why, and then lining those up so they all happen around the same time. But a lot of people kind of just take meetings as they come, and I never recommend that approach. Yeah.
Can I give you guys a quick example of like where I'm at in my business, just so I can get like a more specific feedback?
Sure.
So I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Prego. They're actually the first company in the entire world to patent pending on building the first like all-in-one traffic management solutions. We utilize IoT, we utilize AI, ML, self-sustainable energy, blockchain, and so on and so forth. Right now, Verizon is really interested. We're in talks with them about them investing $3 million in my company, building out my entire IoT infrastructure. And I'm also in talks with DSW about doing strategic implementations across the country, and even had conversations with like royal family members in Dubai about implementing in Dubai. Now, my problem is I have a bunch of people that are looking to give me money, but I want to make the right decision. How can a startup in my position make the right decision based on like that foundation to really succeed?
I'll say this comes from a place of love. It's really hard when an investor hears I'm the first, because off the top of my head I know 3 versions of something similar, right? So any time an investor hears I'm the first or the only, immediately we're like, we see thousands of pitches, so it's really tough when that's the first thing someone says. working with like DOTs is no small feat. Their sales cycles, getting the right advocate internally, even selling into one of those can take years. And so the first thing I'd look for is either somebody on your team that knows how to sell into that, or the understanding of those selling cycles. Because technology can be really great, but if you don't understand how sales work in that industry, it's your first time selling into that industry. I've seen a lot of founders hit some really weird walls, and you're like, I didn't know that would be a thing. And I'm like, well, that's the DOT, you know, like that's just how they roll. So balancing out that narrative. I'll let you answer.
Two more questions. Yeah, go ahead in the back. Yeah.
So I was at SU Denver in the International Business Program, and I was specifically wondering if you've seen a lot of companies in this space that are working internationally. It's like U.S. companies that might have clients abroad, working on projects abroad, and so on.
Can you just comment just a little bit more about the kind of companies you're asking about? Because yes, but say one more sentence.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know much about climate tech, so I'm pretty open-minded. But I guess my question was really if there would be careers in international business.
Got it. Yeah. So let's be very clear. The U.S. is way behind the rest of the world, in particular Europe, and so there's a lot of opportunities there. In fact, one of the biggest things that we try to think about is how do we get ourselves more exposure to particular some of the European companies that are coming together. So if you have language skills that could fit with some of those companies, the possibility you could be part of helping bring some of those ideas back in the States could be a real attractive position for some of those companies. So yes, there's a lot.
And are there any specific names you could drop, or is that just
So if you look like 6 people over in your row, Tim, wave. There's one. Yeah, Tim's with Optera Climate. There's Odyssey Energy Solutions out of Boulder. I mean, we could rattle off a lot. Yeah, tons.
Great. Last question. And we are going to move to the happy hour, so anyone who wants to join.
I just want to say hi to everyone, especially panelists, and appreciate your time today. My name is Sergio. I'm the founder of a tech company around a particular topic we can discuss here. My question is focused in on within your portfolios or within your structure. When you look at, let's say, the verticals of solar power, biorenewable energy, so on and so forth, what do those percentages break down into as opposed to your overall portfolio? What bracket of percentages would you put them in as a container? Would you have to define that?
Can you just, yeah, I will, but can you just articulate a little bit more why you're asking the question, just so I can get at that?
Curious in regards to the background of potential partnerships down the road if you were to choose to work with a company like ours, and we'll get to the meat and bones. But are there synergies within the portfolio that you already have?
Got it.
We're in the solar power industry.
Got it.
So if it's 80% of your checks that you write are in the solar space, and then 20% are divvied
Right.
up within the other sectors, just wanted to understand from that perspective.
Okay. So you were qualifying us for a subsequent discussion. Just checking. So the question was, if I understood it, was I understood it. It was looking at what do our portfolios look like, and I think generally asking that question for investors that are in the climate tech space, what that looks like, and in particular, does that collection allow for more than just one check? Does it allow you to make connections with other opportunities that might add to your business over time? Am I saying that correctly? So I think it really just depends upon the fund. Is really just a big question, and you'll have climate tech funds that are just impact funds that are really worried about the gigaton solution, and they're going to take whatever thing that's going to really get them on that path. We happen to be very focused on the verticals that we're in and looking for solutions that fit in those verticals, and that we're very keen to understand if there's crossovers between those verticals to be able to help people go, and if there's different companies we have in our portfolio that might benefit from each other. So we think about that a lot. I bet you that is the case for almost any of the funds that are of any size that are doing something that's more than single bets. And there are many funds that are kind of like, we do 10 deals a year, and every one of them is going to be a standalone. We want it to be a blow out the top. We have 65 deals, companies in our portfolio. We're looking for, how those synergies can come together.
Only other thing I'll add is we're as investors incredibly proud of the companies that we invest in, so we always put them on our website.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for
Yeah, thank you.
And
Happy hours are right there.
yeah, happy hours at Zocalito, and Haley from Blue Bear is also one of the co-hosts along with the rest of us here. So we welcome you to join us at the, and if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'll introduce Blue Bear Capital really quick. My name's Haley. Blue Bear Capital is located or headquartered out of Los Angeles and also Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And we are investing in the digital layer of the energy transition. So we're looking for data-centric companies, mostly B2B software solutions that are helping transition to a low-carbon future across energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, mobility, you name it in the climate space. So if that's interesting to you all, please come and find me. We're usually seed stage and also Series A. So we're looking for post-revenue companies, and yeah, looking forward to happy hour.